The grease under Linus's fingernails was older than the century, or at least it felt that way to him. It was a slurry of whale oil, graphite, and the microscopic detritus of 1,000 brass gears rubbing themselves into dust. His workshop sat in the damp basement of number 14 Clarges Street, a place where the air always smelled of cold tea and damp wool. Outside, London did what it always did. It shifted. The sky through the street-level grate was a fickle thing. One moment it poured a harsh, blinding white light onto his layout table. The next, a charcoal cloud would roll in from the river, plunging the room into a premature twilight that forced him to strike a match for his oil lamp.
Linus was 34, though his spine, curved from 12 years over a loop, suggested someone who had seen more winters. He fixed things that kept time, which was an irony he didn't particularly enjoy. Time, in his experience, was neither linear nor reliable. It was a fluid, hostile element. The bell above the door didn't ring so much as clank. It was a heavy iron cowbell he'd rigged to prevent the local street urchins from slipping in to steal his brass stock. A woman stepped down the 3 stone steps. She didn't look like the usual clientele, the shopkeepers with broken pocket watches or the landladies with sluggish mantel clocks.
She was younger, perhaps 29, with the sharp, high cheekbones of the East Asian diaspora that populated the docks down in Limehouse, but her accent when she spoke was pure, crisp northern English. She wore a heavy, oversized emerald green knitted cardigan that looked as though it had been washed 100 times too many, its wool pilling at the cuffs. Underneath, a simple white cotton t-shirt showed at her collarbone. "Are you the man who looks inside things?" she asked. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a strange, vibrating clarity to it, like a tuning fork struck in an empty room. Linus didn't remove his loupe. He looked at her through the magnified, distorted lens, which made his right eye appear 3 times its normal size. "Depends on what's broken, miss. If it's your heart, the tavern's 3 doors down. If it's your stove, you want Miller on the corner."
"It's a celestial sphere," she said, ignoring his cynicism. She reached into the deep pocket of the green cardigan and pulled out an object wrapped in a gray silk handkerchief. She laid it on the scarred oak of his bench with a deliberate, trembling slowness. Linus dropped his loupe into his palm. He reached out and unfolded the silk. It was an astrolabe, but not one he had ever seen in any catalog. It was small enough to fit into a coat pocket, made of dark, unpolished gunmetal rather than brass. The reticulation of the reed, the plate that showed the positions of the stars, was so fine it looked like a frozen spiderweb. But someone had ruined it. The main axis pin was bent at a cruel angle, and the brass plates beneath were scored with deep, erratic scratches, as if someone had taken a nail and tried to gouge the stars out of the metal.
"Who did this?" Linus muttered, his professional outrage instantly ignited. "This is 17th century work. Maybe Italian? It's a crime to treat an instrument like this." "I did it," she said. Linus looked up. Her eyes were dark, almost black, but they weren't looking at him. They were tracking something on the wall behind him. A row of swinging pendulums, each moving at its own erratic cadence because Linus never bothered to synchronize his repair jobs. "Why?" "Because the stars were in the wrong place," she said simply. "I looked out my window on Tuesday night. The moon was a crescent, sharp as a sickle, right where the constellation of Cygnus should have been resting. But my book said Cygnus was further west. The sky lied to me, or the book did, or my eyes did. So I tried to move them on the plate to match what I saw. But then the moon went away behind a cloud, and when I looked back down, I forgot what I was trying to fix. I forgot my own name for 4 hours, Mr. Miller." "It's Linus," he said, his voice dropping an octave.
The cynicism had left him. He knew the smell of madness. He'd spent enough time in the company of lonely men who talked to their tools. But this wasn't madness. This was something colder, a structural failure of the mind. "And your name?" "May," she said. She pulled the green cardigan tighter around herself, her fingers burrowing into the wool. "Sometimes I am May. Sometimes I am just the person standing in the room where May used to be." The work began that evening. Linus didn't ask for a deposit, and May didn't offer one. She simply didn't leave. She sat on a three-legged stool by the small coal stove in the corner, her knees pulled up toward her chest, watching him work by the light of a single tallow candle and the blue hiss of his soldering torch. The repair was delicate. To straighten a 300-year-old gunmetal rivet without snapping it required a heat so precise it had to be judged entirely by the color of the metal. Not bright red, not dull cherry, but a specific, fleeting shade of plum.
"The sky out there," May said into the silence, her voice competing with the rhythmic click-tock of a long-case clock against the wall. "It's very loud today." Linus adjusted his flame. "The wind's from the east. It brings the smoke from the brickworks." "No," she said, "not the smell. The light. It's bright enough to peel the skin off your thoughts. Then it drops, like a curtain falling in an empty theater. Do you ever feel like the world is being turned on and off by a boy who doesn't care for the play?" Linus stopped. He held the torch away from the metal. He thought about his mother, who had spent the last 5 years of her life in an asylum in Surrey, looking out a window and asking every 10 minutes when the train was arriving, even though there were no tracks for miles. He remembered the weight of that silence between her questions, the gray, dead space where her soul seemed to go to sleep, while her body stayed awake.
"My mood has its own weather, May," Linus said, his eyes fixed on the bent rivet. "Some days, the sun comes up in my head and everything's simple. I can fix a fusee chain with my eyes shut. Other days, the rain starts before I even open my eyes. The workshop feels like a coffin that hasn't been buried yet. You just have to sit through the damp until the wood dries out. And if it never dries..." "It always does," he lied. "Wood is stubborn that way." She stood up, the green cardigan swaying against her shins, and walked over to the layout table. She didn't look at the astrolabe. She looked at his hands, rough, scarred, stained with ink and oil. "I have these patches," she whispered, "like oil on water. Beautiful colors, but you can't sink your hand into them. I wake up and I know I have a brother, but I can't remember his face. I know I love the smell of jasmine, but I don't know if I've ever seen the flower. I spend half my time looking for the moon because it's the only thing that stays the same size, even when it hides. And the other half, I spend looking for myself in the mirrors of shops, wondering if the girl looking back is going to stay until the afternoon." Linus reached out with a pair of fine-nosed pliers. "Look here," he said, pointing to the central disc of her instrument. "This is the meter. It's the cradle for the whole thing. It doesn't move. The other plates, the tympana, they change depending on your latitude. If you're in London, you use one plate. If you're in Alexandria, you use another. The mistake you made wasn't looking at the stars, May. You tried to change the cradle because you thought you were in the wrong city." She leaned in, her dark hair falling forward, brushing against his shoulder. She smelled of rain and cold tea, the very essence of the street above. "Show me how to find the latitude of this room."
For 3 weeks, the basement became a laboratory of 2 variables. There were days when May arrived with a face as bright and sharp as a winter morning. She would help Linus clean the gears of grandfather clocks, her fingers remarkably steady as she dropped tiny jewels into their oil sinks. On those days, she spoke of her childhood in the north, of the gray limestone hills and the way the sheep looked like clouds dropped onto the grass. She laughed, a short, barking sound that made Linus's heart do a strange, clumsy hop inside his chest. The world on those days was an uncomplicated machine, well-oiled and predictable. Then, without warning, The weather would turn. She would arrive with her cardigan buttoned wrong, her eyes dull and unfocused. She would sit on the stool and wouldn't know what the brass instrument on the table was for. "What is that?" she asked on a Thursday, when the fog was so thick the street lamps were lit at noon. "Your astrolabe, May," Linus said gently. He had learned not to rush her.
"Who am I?" she asked. There was no panic in her voice, only a profound, exhausting sadness. It was the question of a traveler who had checked into a hotel and found all the registers blank. Linus laid down his file. He walked over to her, his heavy boots clicking on the flagstones. He didn't touch her. He knew instinctively that touch during the dark hours felt to her like an intrusion, a pressure on a bruise. "You are May Chen," he said, speaking into the dimness. "You live at number 8 Great Orm Street. You have a cat with one ear named Barnaby. You prefer your tea with 2 lumps of sugar, but you always forget to stir it, so the last sip is too sweet. You are an astronomer who has lost her map, but you're helping me build a new one." She looked up at him through her tangled hair. "Are you sure? Or are you just making up a story for the girl in the green sweater?" Linus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of brass scrap. He had engraved 3 words onto it with his finest burin. He placed it in her small palm. She held it up to the candle. The words read, "The cradle holds." "That's for when you can't find the moon," Linus said. "It doesn't matter if you forget the stars, May. The brass remembers where they belong."
A sudden tear, fat and clear, ran down her cheek, catching the yellow light of the tallow. She didn't wipe it away. "It hurts," she whispered. "The waking up inside the dark, knowing there's an entire world out there. People buying bread, horses pulling carts, children running, and I am behind a pane of glass that I can't break through. Why is the world so beautiful out there when I am so broken in here?" Linus sat down on the floor beside her stool, his back against the damp brick wall. "The world isn't beautiful because it's perfect, May. It's beautiful because it's heavy. If it were light, it would float away. The bread, the horses, the children, they're all just trying to keep their feet on the ground, same as us. The glass you're behind, it's not glass. It's just the shadow of a cloud passing over. Shadows don't have any weight. They can't hold you down unless you let them convince you they're made of stone." They sat together for 3 hours in the dark, until the cowbell clanked, and a small boy brought Linus a loaf of rye bread he'd ordered. By the time the bread arrived, the fog had lifted slightly, and May was looking at the astrolabe again, her thumb tracing the repaired gunmetal pin.
The climax of their small, quiet universe came on the night of the solstice. The sky had been a monster all day, violet gray and smelling of ozone. Linus had spent the afternoon reinforcing the mainspring of a church clock from Southwark, his arms aching from the tension of the steel. May hadn't spoken since noon. She had been drifting in that liminal space where she was half present, her body moving with a slow, ghostly lethargy. At 9 o'clock, the storm broke. Not with rain, but with a wind that rattled the street grate above their heads like a prison door. And then, the moon appeared. It wasn't the pale, polite sliver of the previous weeks. It was a massive orange hunter's moon, swollen by the atmospheric distortion of the river mist, hanging directly in the frame of the high, arched basement window. It looked close enough to touch, a great glowing eye peering into their cellar.
May stood up so fast her stool overturned with a dull clatter. "Linus!" she gasped. Her voice was different now. It wasn't the dull tone of her forgotten days, nor was it the sharp clarity of her bright ones. It was a third thing, a voice of raw, unadorned terror and wonder combined. "It's too close. The sky is falling into the room." Linus jumped to his feet, his loop flying from his pocket and shattering on the floor. He didn't care about the glass.
He saw her hands shaking so violently she could barely hold the gunmetal astrolabe, which she had grabbed from the bench. "May, look at me," he commanded, stepping between her and the window. "I can't see you," she cried, her eyes wide, reflecting the orange glare of the moon. "There are two of you. One is fixing a clock and the other is leaving through the door. Which one is real? Which one am I supposed to remember?" She was losing the cradle. The plates of her mind were spinning out of their tracks, the alignment pins snapping under the weight of some internal storm.
Linus did the only thing his mechanical mind knew how to do when a gear train was run away. He didn't try to stop it with force. He gave it something bigger to turn. He reached out and grabbed her hands, not her wrists, but her hands, forcing her fingers to close around the gunmetal astrolabe between them. The sharp edges of the reticulated plate bit into his palms, and he felt her skin, freezing cold against his own hot, oily flesh. "We are going to take the measurement," he said, his voice roaring over the sound of the wind in the grate. "I don't know the formula," she screamed, trying to pull away. "I forgot the numbers." "The numbers don't matter," Linus shouted back. He forced her to lift the instrument up between their faces, so they were both looking through the tiny alidade, the sighting rule, toward the great orange disc in the window. "Look through the sights, May! Look at the top edge of the rim! Tell me what you see!" "Nothing! Just light!" "Look closer! Past the light!" She stopped struggling. Her breath came in ragged, sobbing gasps against his chin. Her emerald sweater was soaked at the collar from her sweat. She focused her right eye through the pinhole of the gunmetal rule.
The world seemed to hold its breath. The grandfather clocks in the workshop, by some freak of mechanical coincidence, all hit their hour at once. A chorus of silver bells and deep brass chimes that filled the basement with a wall of resonance. It's 41 degrees, she whispered. Her voice trembled, but the vibration had changed. It was solid again. 41 degrees from what? Linus asked, his hands still covering hers, feeling the heat slowly returning to her skin. From the horizon, she said. She lowered the instrument. The orange light on her face seemed to soften from a threat into a caress. She looked at Linus, really looked at him, with an eye that saw the grease on his cheek and the graying hair at his temples. 41 degrees from where we are standing. We are at Clarges Street. You are Linus. You smell like whale oil and bad tea. And you? He asked, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. I am May, she said, her shoulders dropping 3 inches as the tension drained from her. I have a green cardigan that my mother knit for me when I went away to school. It has a dropped stitch under the left armpit. I remember it now. Linus slowly let go of her hands. His own palms were bleeding slightly from the sharp brass stars of the wreath. He looked down at the blood, then up at her. He smiled, a small, tired movement of his lips. The instrument is accurate, he said. The stars are exactly where they belong.
They didn't save each other. The world doesn't work in the way of the cheap fables sold on the street corners. There was no magic tincture that cured May's mind, and Linus's workshop remained damp and dark. The fog would return tomorrow, and with it, the possibility that May would again forget the color of jasmine or the face of her brother. But as they sat on the floor of the workshop, sharing the rye bread, using a greasy pocket knife to cut the slices, the world outside the grate didn't seem so hostile anymore. The sky above London shifted from orange to a deep, quiet indigo. The ground beneath them stayed solid. May picked up her astrolabe and wrapped it back in the gray silk handkerchief. She didn't put it in her pocket this time. She left it on the center of Linus's layout table, next to his finest oilstone. "Leave it there," she said, pulling her green cardigan around herself as she prepared to face the cold climb up the stone steps. "So I know where to look for it when the weather changes." Linus stood by the door, the iron cowbell silent above him. "It'll be right here, May. I don't move my benches." She looked back from the second step, her face illuminated by the last rays of the setting moon. The world is very big, Linus, and it's very strange, but it's remarkable how much fits into a cellar if you have the right tools to measure it. He watched her go until her emerald green sweater disappeared into the dark of the street above. Then he walked back to his bench, picked up his loop, and went back to work on a clock that had all the time in the world.